going to call the meeting to order and welcome everyone to meeting number 138, House of Commons Standing Committee of Canadian Heritage. Today's meeting is taking place in the hybrid format. I would like to remind participants of the following points. Before speaking, of course, please wait until I recognize you by name. For members participating in person, thank you, Ms. Day. Or Zoom, please raise your hand if you wish to speak. The clerk and I will do the best, as always, to maintain the speaking order for you. And a reminder that all comments, of course, should be directed through the chair, as always. All witnesses have completed the requirement connection tests in advance of this meeting. I will say that Richard Moon is not with us in the first hour and a half. He had technical issues, so we only have 3 guests. So our study is the protection of freedom of expression pursuant to Standing Order 108-2 and the motion adopted by the committee on Wednesday, September 18th, 2024. The committee shall resume its study of the protection of freedom of expression. I would like to welcome our witnesses today. We have one with us, Shannon Day, Dean, Faculty of Arts, University of Regina. We have with us Emily Laidlaw, the Associate Professor and Canada Research Chair, Cybersecurity Law, University of Calgary. She's video conference. And we also have Gay Grant from BC, the Litigation Staff Counsel, and from the BC Civil Liberties Association. So once again, Mr. Moon is not with us. We only have 3 guests. We have an extended 3 hours today, 1 hour more. My plan today would be probably to go till 12:20 with the first 3. Then we'll take a break, get set for the second group. That will give us time for a little bit of lunch, maybe 10 or 15-minute break, and then we'll go from there. 12:20 to about 12:35 after we get our sound checks for the second group that we have. So that's the game plan. We also have question periods, so maybe we can get out of here by 1:50 to 1:55. We'll see how it goes. Okay, Shannon Day, the Dean, Faculty of Arts, you have 5 minutes. Welcome to Canadian Heritage. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm a philosopher and Dean of Arts at the University of Regina. I'm here today as a scholar of academic freedom and campus freedom of expression. As a dean, I have the opportunity to observe and defend academic freedom in practice, but my remarks reflect my own scholarship and do not represent the University of Regina or the Faculty of Arts. Academic freedom is distinct from freedom of expression, but they are deeply entwined. Academic freedom enables post-secondary scholarly personnel to pursue without interference or reprisal university's academic mission to seek truth and advance understanding in the service of society. Academic freedom includes 2 varieties of expressive freedom: freedom of intramural expression, which can include criticism of the university, and freedom of extramural expression, scholarly personnel's freedom to engage in speech in the public sphere. These expressive freedoms are unlimited so long as they are lawful. By contrast, academic freedom occurs within systems of academic quality control exercised by scholarly personnel. For instance, scholarly referees and editors adjudicate publication decisions, and collegial bodies determine curricula. The first modern implementation of academic freedom was in the establishment in 1809 of the University of Berlin, the first modern research university. Its founder, Wilhelm von Humboldt, enshrined as twin principles of the university solitude and freedom. By freedom, he meant unconstrained curiosity-based research, teaching, and learning by scholarly personnel, including students. By solitude, he meant isolation from outside interference, an early exemplar of what is today termed institutional autonomy. The need to provide protections against external and, in particular, political interference was especially important since German universities were essentially a branch of government. Thus, from 1848 to 1933, German constitutions enshrined academic freedom protections. In some states, such as pre-1933 Germany and post-apartheid South Africa, academic freedom receives distinct constitutional protection. In others, it receives indirect constitutional protection via freedom of expression provisions. The 2 examples of constitutionally protected academic freedom I just gave point to an important fact about academic freedom. It flourishes in democracies, it dies under authoritarian rule. With Hitler's rise to power in 1933, academic freedom was abolished in Germany. Jewish professors were fired. Remaining professors were forced to teach Nazi race science. By contrast, when the Mandela government sought to rebuild an equitable and democratic South Africa, it enshrined academic freedom in the Constitution. Wherever authoritarianism is on the rise in our own time, we see corresponding attacks on academic freedom and universities' institutional autonomy. In recent years, we have seen government bans on teaching gender studies in Hungary and Poland, and on teaching critical race theory in a number of US states. Provincial governments in Ontario, Quebec, and Alberta have threatened universities' Humboldtian solitude by imposing on them free speech policies that, far from protecting expressive freedom, actually undercut institutional autonomy, as well as placing censorious limits on student protest, a time-worn form of campus expression that has long been, among other things, a mode whereby students develop their moral and intellectual autonomy. In the US, the December 2023 United States Congress hearing on anti-Semitism marked a new chapter in state interference in academic freedom, campus expressive freedom, and institutional autonomy. Representatives' interrogation of 3 college presidents regarding their universities' approach to solidarity statements, institutional neutrality, and student protest was deeply chilling, not least because 2 of the presidents' replies were politically weaponized to force their resignations. The most aggressive interrogator of the U.S. university presidents was Representative Elise Stefanik, recently tapped to be U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. Representative Stefanik claimed that the hearing and resignations were just the beginning of the reckoning, and that Republicans will carry out a long overdue cleansing of higher education. A week after the congressional hearing, 5 MPs wrote to Canadian university presidents to exert similar pressure on them. This would have been a wildly inappropriate state challenge to institutional autonomy if it had come from provincial governments. It was even more shocking and unprecedented coming from federal members of parliament, given that education is under provincial, not federal jurisdiction. Some MPs continue to make public statements aimed at chilling expression about Israel and Palestine within educational institutions. Canada's universities make crucial contributions to science, society, industry, and the economy. Despite recent challenges, academic freedom is healthier in Canada than anywhere else in the world. It is crucial for Canadian lawmakers to reaffirm academic freedom and universities' institutional autonomy so that Canadian universities can continue to contribute to science, industry, and society while preserving the crucial protections of solitude and freedom for the universities of tomorrow, both in Canada and worldwide. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Day. You still had another minute, but we'll have lots of questions around the table for you. Thank you very much. We move now to Emily Laidlaw, Associate Professor and Canada Research Chair in Cybersecurity Law, University of Calgary. So, Ms. Laidlaw, if you wish, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. When I teach freedom of expression to my law students, we start with the question, what does freedom of expression mean to you? Before looking at the law or philosophy, we should all start with the question of what expression means to us personally. It touches every aspect of our lives and democracy, and this meaningfulness is what informs our legal structure. A commitment to freedom of expression asks a lot of us. It asks us to protect offensive, disturbing, and shocking expression on the belief that society as a whole benefits, even if individuals are caught in the crosshairs. But it is not an absolute right, and it never has been. Canadian courts have generally adopted a negative approach to freedom of expression, assuming that if government just stays out of the way, we'll be free. This, I suggest, is a false assumption. We do not enjoy equal freedom to express ourselves, and law can be an important vehicle to protect and promote freedom of expression. This is especially important in the area of technology law, which is where I work, where laws targeting private companies are an important vehicle to ensure users' rights are protected. When I got into this area almost 20 years ago, my focus was on how technology companies had become private arbiters of expression. No matter what we want to do online, we rely on a private company to make it happen. They decide who has access, what content stays up, comes down, systems of dispute resolution, how their sites are designed, using persuasive techniques to nudge behavior such as endless scrolling, rewards, notifications, likes, essentially hijacking our minds. This means these companies have extraordinary power, more than most states. They are the deciders of global free expression norms, and there's minimal transparency about their practices and minimal legal mechanisms with which to hold these companies accountable. These companies are also soft targets for government pressure to remove certain content called job owning. At its worst, it operates as a form of shadow regulation. Government A pressures platform Y to remove certain content. More commonly, law enforcement, for example, investigates whether a post is criminal hate speech. They think it might be, but in the meantime, they think it probably violates the platform's own terms and conditions. Law enforcement notifies the platform of the post, and the platform independently assesses it against its own moderation processes. In this situation, is the state suppressing lawful expression? Generally, no, but it matters how this is done, and informal measures always risk being illegitimate in substance or appearance. Now, I don't want to give the impression that the companies are bad actors. Many are the source of innovation to the problems we face. But in the end, these are just companies. They're not good or bad. But they do have fiduciary responsibilities to act in their company's best interests. So there's only so much they can ever do to act in society's best interests. And some companies elect to do very little. So my message is this: when companies are this powerful and have this much impact on society, it is the government's job to create a legal framework around that. So there's two key steps that are crucial to promote and protect freedom of expression and address online harms. First is to pass Part 1 of Bill C-63 after, of course, careful study and amendments. It proposes a systemic approach to social media regulation. What do I mean by a systemic approach? This approach is not concerned about specific content, whether this post or that is hate propaganda, and whether a company leaves it up or takes it down. Rather, it targets the system that makes social media tick. What content moderation systems does the company have in place? Does it provide due process? Does the platform address the risks of the recommender system? Does the company have a plan to address inauthentic accounts and manipulation of its systems by bots and deepfakes? The companies are required to be transparent about their practices, and a regulator can investigate companies for failing to have proper systems in place. In terms of freedom of expression, a systemic approach is the best in class to provide the most protection to freedom of expression while targeting the core problems social media has made so much worse. Second, and finally, reform data privacy law and introduce AI legislation, such as some form of Bill C-27. These are data-driven businesses. The design of their interfaces, their practices concerning the collection, use, and disclosure of user data, and their use of AI systems provide the keys to our minds and health and our agency to participate and express ourselves freely. Privacy has always been key to the enjoyment of freedom of expression, and therefore Bill C-27, or some version of it, is a key complement to Bill C-63. Thank you.
Very much, Ms. Laidlaw. We move to our third and final panel. Gaw Grant, the Litigation Staff Counsel for the BC Civil Liberties Association. You have 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Hello, and thank you for having us. The BCCLA is Canada's oldest and largest civil liberties organization. While we have many concerns about the state of freedom of expression in Canada, I'll focus today on two urgent human rights aspects. Because for civil liberties to be real for everyone, we must fight not only for the rights of the privileged, but also for those who are most marginalized in our society. While the Charter guarantees everyone freedom of expression, including protest as democratic participation, this right is not applied equally. Evidence shows that certain communities are disproportionately surveilled and targeted by Canada, suppressing their freedom of expression. First, the BCCLA has long raised concerns about Canada's targeting and criminalization of Indigenous land and water protectors. We're one of 60 Indigenous and civil society organizations calling for the dismantling of the RCMP's paramilitary unit called the Critical Response Unit, CRU, formerly the Community Industry Response Group. Amnesty International's 2023 report highlighted the ongoing human rights violations against Wet'suwet'en land defenders opposing the Coastal GasLink pipeline. The CRU has used unlawful surveillance, disturbing excessive force, harassment, and dispossession, despite the Wet'suwet'en's legal right to oppose projects on unceded land without consent. Similar violations occurred at Fairy Creek blockade, where their arbitrary and illegal exclusion zones violated charter rights, including freedom of the expression of the media. Disturbing recordings played in court revealed that CRU officers were referring to Indigenous land defenders as, quote, orcs and ogres, while mocking missing and murdered Indigenous women. All of these actions contradict Canada's commitments to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and has been condemned by a collection of UN special rapporteurs. The CRU is currently subject to over 500 citizen complaints, serious lawsuits, and an outstanding investigation by the chairperson of the Civilian Review and Complaints Commission for the RCMP. The CRU is now collaborating with local police to target Palestine solidarity demonstrations without any public transparency. This brings me to the second pressing issue, the extreme chill and political expression that we are witnessing on free expression in solidarity with Palestinian human rights or critical of the state of Israel. This year, the International Court of Justice ruled that Israel is likely committing genocide in Gaza, as well as committing ongoing apartheid and illegal occupation of Palestine. The UN Special Committee now found Israel's warfare consistent with genocide, including use of starvation as a weapon of war. Yet Canada continues to support and provide arms to Israel. We have written numerous letters to police and Crown prosecutors regarding unconstitutional or disproportionate criminal charges and police response against protesters. For example, the CRU labeled Palestine solidarity protests as, quote, pro-Hamas and terrorist supporting, an untrue smear that fuels anti-Palestinian racism. Such language has also been used by many politicians and police. Recently, the Ministry of Heritage published the Canadian Handbook on the IHRA Working Definition of Anti-Semitism, which advocates for implementation in policing and across society. This deeply problematic and controversial definition of anti-Semitism goes beyond fighting anti-Semitism proper, a goal we all share, to conflate political critique of Israel with Jewish people, promoting anti-Palestinian racial network. Such a conflation of Jewish people with the state of Israel is itself anti-Semitic and opposes Jewish freedom of expression. The IHRA definition and handbook has disturbing censorious consequences and needs to be immediately revoked. Dr. G's testimony before this committee is but one example of the regular calls we receive from people who are losing their jobs, facing discipline, harassment, or unjust police charges for exercising their charter rights. I myself personally have fear speaking publicly before the committee on this issue. But as a person who is both half Jewish and half Lebanese, I believe that the human rights and liberation of all people is never opposing but interconnected, because suppressing one group's rights leads to suppression of everyone's rights. Controversial debate is essential and healthy for democracy. A true democracy is measured by how it handles dissent, particularly when that dissent challenges the government or entrenched political interests. We call on Canada to abolish the CRU, improve police accountability, respect the rights of Indigenous people, stop political and policing efforts to suppress expression and solidarity with the people of Palestine, and revoke the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism so that we can have freedom of expression for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Grant. Right on time. So the first round of questioning will be 6 minutes long. We'll start with Mr. Gord of the Conservative Party. Mr. Gord.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank all the witnesses for being with us this morning. This study is very important for us and for Canadians. Now, when we talk about the freedom of expression, we also talk about the freedom of conscience. My question will be to all three witnesses. You can take turns and answer the question. What can harm the freedom of expression? Acts, examples, past experiences from the 5 to 10 years, preceding years. What could have hurt the freedom of expression and conscience of Canadians?
Dr. J, lead us off.
Yeah, thank you very much. There has never been a time in human history when freedom of expression hasn't been under threat. That's precisely why we need to enshrine protections for it. If it were not threatened, it wouldn't require protections. The particular threats change from one era to another and one place to another. In my perspective, in the past 5 to 10 years, we've seen increased polarization and weaponization of again, polarized tropes that, for instance, represent universities as hotbeds of radicalism and as harmful to society, increasing culture war combativeness on social media also doesn't take into consideration the degree to which social media can exacerbate and further polarize debate. The debate that we used to be able to have 20 years ago in the town square is now made worse and more polarized by harmful algorithms. Maybe I'll stop there so others can respond as well.
Madame Ledlow.
Thank you. Context of social media, which is where I do a lot of my work. I've done quite a bit of work on this recently, and about how it's actually our freedom of thought and opinion that is being essentially hacked by the algorithms, by the ads on social media, because they structure the spaces a particular way. The algorithms push certain information to you, and it might be repetitive information. It's that idea that you end up down that rabbit hole, and it undermines your own agency to freely develop your thoughts. We're seeing that to the extent that everyone ends up in their silos when it comes to the political information that they're consuming. But in the context of children, I mean, I look at the wider gamut of these issues. We're seeing it with pushing eating disorders, self-harm content to children, etc. On a broader perspective, I thought it was interesting that you asked the question of what harm has freedom of expression caused. And I do want to bring us back to that legal threshold, because freedom of expression causes all kinds of harm. We just believe that it's important to the importance of freedom of expression it's so key that we're willing to put up with that. But legally, there is a threshold in all kinds of circumstances where that harm is too great and the law intervenes. I mean, the law is used to defend reputations, but it's quite a high threshold in defamation law to find that reputational harm is actually a legal issue, and that's going to, intervene in some way to shut that down. We see that in criminal law with whether it's hate propaganda, it's fraud. Where we're in a complex space now is that this is always highly contextual, and in social media, you have this massive volume. And so you can't deal with it at scale. It is being decided, though. So, for example, this will be my last comment, from the river to the sea has been a point of controversy. Meta, their oversight board, did an entire investigation of that, made a determination of whether that fell foul of their terms and conditions of service, looking at through international human rights. So these issues are being decided in all kinds of corners, and I'll leave it there for now.
Madame Gouin, s'il vous plaît.
I apologize. I only figured out how to turn on the translation after your question. Would you be able to repeat the question?
So the question is, have you experienced events or actions that could have harmed the freedom of expression in Canada in the last 5 to 10 years?
Okay. Sorry. Have I experienced, or what have we witnessed? I think we've witnessed, really concerning state suppression of particular groups, which is the subject of my statement today. Canada disproportionately surveils and targets certain communities, suppressing their freedom of expression and their charter rights. So the two examples that I gave in terms of people exercising their Indigenous rights, so Indigenous land and water protectors, and also Palestine solidarity expression, we're seeing being quite targeted in the past year. There's been numerous examples of people being charged for expression that is not hateful, does not meet the stringent standard that we have in the case law. So we are seeing a chilling effect on speech, because chilling one group's rights does have impacts more broadly on people's confidence to exercise their rights, no matter what the speech is. When they see people being criminalized, when they see what happens to other people exercising their rights, it does impact more broadly. I apologize if I didn't quite understand the question.
Merci.
Mr. Gord, thank you very much. That was 6 minutes. We'll go to the Liberal Party. Welcome, Mr. Noor Mohammed, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being with us. I wanted to talk a little bit and hear from all of you, really, on the topic of the consequences of freedom of expression, because we've heard a couple of comments to this effect. And I want to focus specifically on when political leaders lie to either incite or to cause people to believe something that is untrue to the detriment, not necessarily of government or to the opposition, but to the detriment of Canadian society. Recently, we had an example of a member of Parliament from the Conservative Party that said that used her freedom of expression to say that the cost of living crisis had driven parents to traffic their own children. We then had the leader of the opposition make a very public statement that prayer had been banned from Remembrance Day services. These were proven to be out-and-out lies, and I'm using that word specifically because a lie is something that is not true, and both of those things are proven to not to be true. What are the consequences of those types of expressions of freedom of expression?
Point of order, yes.
Chair, it's my understanding, in fact, when I called the Prime Minister a liar in the House of Commons, I was kicked out because it's unparliamentary. The Prime Minister had lied. I called him out on that. I got kicked out. I'd suggest that Mr. Noor Mohammed is maybe treading on the grounds of what is unparliamentary language and should use his words more judiciously and to ensure that he is, because what I would suggest, not to get into debate, but it's conjecture and opinion to which he's suggesting as opposed to the discussion to which we're having about freedom of discussion.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Noor Mohammed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I turn that question over to first I'm going to start with you, Professor Day, and then we'll go to Professor Laidlaw.
I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is that freedom of expression does not have the quality control that, for instance, academic freedom does. People get to lie. Now, there may be parliamentary rules that I'm not aware of, that you're more aware than I am, but freedom of expression does not come with quality control. That's the first thing. It's important to note as well, though, that when people say things that aren't true, they're not necessarily lying. Not to be too much of a philosopher, we say lots of untrue things sincerely, out of sincere error all the time. So it's important to disambiguate between misinformation, which might be a sincere error, and disinformation, which is an intentional lie, right? Obviously, though, the consequences of both misinformation and disinformation are a confused public that can reason badly about important matters of the day. But I will add that, this is maybe, again, too philosophical a point, people can also say true things that are selective that will mislead people as well. So utterances in general have consequences, true or false, sincere or insincere.
And Professor Laidlaw?
Thank you, and I appreciate Dr. D weighing in on the philosophical side, because I think it is a philosophical question no matter what. And I will say that for the most part, we're allowed to say and express false things. There are only narrow circumstances legally where falsity is, I'd say, a problem, whether criminally and civilly. The circumstances of, for example, fraud criminally or defamation civilly. But again, I mean, I guess that's criminal too. You were talking about narrow circumstances where, say, an individual's reputation is harmed. And I say this then, that space of mis and disinformation is really difficult to deal with because the Supreme Court's made very clear that we protect false information because it might be the ideas of the future. Because, as Dr. D said, we might believe it to be true. And part of that process of expressing ourselves is how we all figure out the truth. The challenge that we're facing is that there's no doubt that it does cause harm and that social media amplifies that harm because it reaches greater audiences. Some of the work I am exploring and I talk about a lot with my students is, elected officials are both the targets of attacks. They face extraordinary harassment, but they also have tremendous power. And when they say something, especially now with social media, it reaches an audience that is unprecedented. And so falsity takes on a characteristic that we did not see before.
And that
doesn't help us solve it.
And that's really what I was trying to get at. I mean, I think we all agree that people have the right, within the constraints you've identified, to say what they like and to make up whatever they want to make up and mislead if they choose to mislead. I guess the question that I have is, in a world where information or disinformation is flowing at this kind of rate and pace, how do we start to think about actual consequences of this when it drives people to do things or to act in ways that then can cross the line that perhaps was not intended, right? I can't imagine that when people make statements that they intend for people to go out and do terrible things. But how should we as politicians think about how to manage the things that we say without regulating perhaps what we say? Don't be starting to take people's freedom away. But how do we, or what obligation should we have to think about the consequences of our words and the actions that they might inspire in others? I guess is the question really that I want to get to.
Yeah, and so what I will tell you is what I tell city councilors in Calgary, because I separately am their ethics advisor. So I take it from defamation, which is you can have whatever opinion you want, and you can express that freely. Just say the factual basis of it so that anyone hearing it can be in a position to agree or disagree with you. And that's an ethical question, isn't it? Where we're asking any elected official to really be faithful to facts, to set that out clearly, and then express that opinion. I think that's the way forward. That's not, there's no oversight mechanism for it, but that's what the goal should be.
Right on. 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Noor Mohammed. We'll go now to the block. Mr. Shampoo for 6 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank the witnesses for being with us today. Thank you. This is an important study, and it is a delicate, sensitive subject, and we have a lot of conversations around this topic. So, Ms. D, in your opening remarks, you referred to the limit to the freedom of expression in universities in Quebec. Can you talk about specific cases on that? Because I just want to frame what you referred to there.
That occur within academic freedom. Yeah, so the important thing about academic freedom is that the limits are self-determined by appropriately placed scholars with the appropriate expertise themselves. And so, for instance, I have a faculty or a department of psychology that is accredited to offer degrees in clinical psychology. It is clinical psychologists across the country who determine what the accreditation standards are. They draw on their scholarship to do so. And then psychology departments across the country respect those accreditation standards in their curricula.
C'est parce que vous avez parlé spécifiquement de cas au Québec.
Well, because you specifically referred to cases in Quebec in your opening remarks, I'm just trying to understand what you were referring to.
Okay, so not academic freedom per se, but the concern about institutional autonomy. So yes, in Ontario, Quebec, and Alberta, the provinces imposed on universities the requirement to have a particular kind of free speech policy for the university. It was Bill 33 in Quebec. It was non-legislative in Ontario and Alberta. So the limitations there are really limitations on university autonomy. Most universities already have freedom of expression policies. Universities have stronger freedom of expression than almost perhaps any other institution in the world. And so this external imposition was unnecessary and was an imposition for the sake of imposition, arguably, which unnecessarily curtailed universities' institutional autonomy.
Vous avez parlé aussi tantôt.
This might not be your field of expertise, maybe, but you briefly touched upon it. That's why I'll ask the question. In your opening remarks, you referred to freedom of expression being limitless as long as it's being exercised within legal boundaries. Now, you are right in saying that the freedom of expression, of course, should take place within a legal framework, and it's usually defined by the criminal code, for instance. But do you think that it's justified for the state to put limits on or introduce frameworks to social media platforms, which are, of course, tools to share information, knowledge, etc. in our society? So do you think that social media platforms should be subject to certain limitations by the state because it doesn't always overlap with the legal framework necessarily. For social media, would you be, or do you think that they should be, there should be frameworks in place that follow, of course, the fundamental principles of the freedom of expression?
I would rather refer that question to my colleague who has appropriate expertise. I don't have expertise in the legal context for social media.
Ben, ce serait Mme Laidlaw à ce moment-là, j'imagine, à qui vous voudriez vous référer.
It might be Ms. Laidlaw in that case. Ms. Laidlaw, would you have an opinion on that point?
Yes, when it comes to the social media one, I strongly recommend that social media is regulated. But let me be clear. There's content regulation where the state puts obligations on social media to act on specific content, like an individual post. That's much more complicated and tends to be more ineffective to deal with some of these problems. So that systemic approach that I was talking about for Bill C-63, that's crucial. And that is the approach being taken by other jurisdictions like Europe, Australia, the UK. There's now a global online harms network where they're basically trying to create coherence because these are global companies. The one thing that I want to flag is that's not necessarily going to address everything to do with something like falsity and some of the challenges we're facing when it comes to more of the mis and disinformation space. What is proposed in Canada addresses more in the areas of kind of hate speech and terrorist propaganda and incitement to violence. Europe has taken on directly mis and disinformation, like election information and discourse. That's difficult. That's really challenging to take on. The role of the government to try to improve the general health of the ecosystem in this murkier area is much more risky and complicated, and I don't want to take up too much time, so I won't dive too deep into that, but I want to flag that wouldn't be solved necessarily.
Mon temps est presque écoulé, effectivement.
So I'm almost out of my allotted time, but I'll have one last question, Ms. Laidlaw, because you referred to the damages caused by the freedom of expression, and indeed, sometimes people harmed by some remarks. But in general, when the freedom of expression is used within the legal framework, what you're referring to is people's sensitivities based on personal values, or is it larger than that? If you can provide a quick answer to that.
I would say it's larger than that. I mean, there are absolutely
Quick answer, please.
Dimensions
Quick
to
answer.
this, which is people have different sensitivity levels, and that's why we still protect offensive expression and shocking expression. But there is the issue that there is a chilling effect generally, in particular on more marginalized groups from even participating in spaces.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Laidlaw. We've got to move on. Thank you, Mr. Shampoo. We welcome Mr. Desjardins from the New Democratic Party for 6 minutes. Way you go for 6 then. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I want to thank my colleagues for undertaking what I believe to be a very important study. Of course, democracy is only valued should people have a voice? Should people be able to exercise that voice? Should people be able to manifest that voice in a way that their counterparts or other Canadians could understand? And be able to have tough conversations, conversations that democratic societies must ensure are had in order to come to a moral resolve, a concrete resolve, a resolve that makes us hopefully more united and able to challenge the credible issues facing Canadians. Part of that is ensuring that people have the ability to speak truth to power. As an Indigenous member of Parliament from the Prairies, I particularly feel the importance of this issue. Several witnesses today have made mention about the critical necessity to challenge some of the very real barriers that are facing persons' legitimate right to freedom of expression. It was made mention by the BC Civil Liberties Group, for example, which are champions and at the forefront of protecting Canadians' expression rights today, mentioned that there was really two groups that are seeing extraordinary level of surveillance. That's Indigenous people, First Nations in particular, that are fighting corporate exploitation of their lands, whether that's Wet'suwet'en or Fairy Creek, or whether it's Palestinians who are speaking up about their loved ones who are facing a genocide in Palestine and need to find ways to express their very legitimate and very deep concerns with how our planet, how our Earth, and how our global society is being organized towards the complicity of that violence. However, the BC Civil Liberties Group, Grant, you made testimony related to some of the real and severe issues that are being faced when it comes to the types of repression that these organizations face, whether Indigenous or part of the Palestinian movement. We're seeing police being utilized in very extreme ways. You had to deal with this. Your organization released an arrest handbook and pocketbook. Can you talk a bit about why the BC Civil Liberties Group needed or felt they needed to produce such a handbook?
Thank you. I wish there wasn't a need for us to have this publication, but it is our most widely requested publication because there is a real power imbalance between individuals and the police. So especially when people are members of marginalized and over-policed communities, those communities that tend to be subject to extra and disproportionate surveillance by police and by the state. And people need to know their rights because when they don't, this facilitates abuse of powers by police. And unfortunately, police frequently do not respect charter rights. They may engage in excessive force or failure to follow, like court injunction orders or protocol going beyond what is their power. And we see that disproportionately happening when it comes to people who are racialized, Indigenous, or from other marginalized communities. So in our new version of the arrest handbook, we included new sections for heavily policed communities. And it is one of the biggest challenges of writing the handbook is it was a bit messed up to have to tell people, these are your rights, but they very well might not be respected by the police. And in fact, if you assert your rights, if you stand up for them in this situation, it may make you more unsafe. It may expose you to more danger. So a major problem that we have is that existing mechanisms for police oversight and accountability are not working. They do not provide justice for individuals and communities that are harmed by policing. So to protect everyone's freedom of expression, Canada really needs to improve police accountability mechanisms, making them more independent, more robust, and timely.
Thank you very much for that. I have some follow-up, particularly to the last comment you made about the consequences of having your voice heard. When you challenge credible authority, when you challenge power, there's often this response that is extraordinary and, in fact, limits and suppresses one's ability and rights to freedom of expression. In particular, when it came to students, we've seen this as a severe issue. Following Israel's intense bombing campaign in Gaza, left over 40,000 Palestinians killed by Israeli forces. Student-led encampments demanding their universities divest from companies complicit in funding Israeli-led genocide began emerging right across the country. The BC Civil Liberties Group was forced to intervene at the BC Supreme Court to defend the rights of students whose expression rights were being repressed. You were involved in that intervention. In your submission, you wrote, quote, "The courts must take account of essential charter protections for free expression and assembly when issuing injunctions. Students must be able to confidently rely on their charter rights. Seeking and attaining the truth, as well as participating in social and political decision-making, are at the core of why we protect free expression. Property rights are not a magical override for constitutional rights." Can you please explain to us your experience in this case and how the courts treated the interplay between the expression rights and property rights?
So if you said to, I think, an average Canadian, if you're exercising your charter right to freedom of expression, what does that mean? And when can it be restricted? I think people would be shocked to know that frequently, what we are seeing is injunctions are being used to restrict protest rights without even considering charter rights, because it's not necessary in that analysis. And because of that, it's become basically an easy way for corporations and other powerful institutions, including universities, which are funded by the state. It's become an easy way for them to silence freedom of expression and remove protesters without even having the charter rights considered. So that is why we intervened in the Vancouver Island University case and have intervened in similar cases before to argue that the law needs to adapt to consider charter rights. If these are our fundamental rights that are so important to our democracy, they're protected in the Constitution, and we have principles at law that says the common law and decisions that judges make should be aligning with the Charter and its values, because these principles are so integral to our liberal democracy.
Thank you, Ms. Grant. Yeah, we're over. Thank you, Mr. Desjardins. We'll move now to the second round for 5 minutes. Mr. Giovanni, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. D, I'd like to start with you. I'm curious, you know, a lot of Canadians are concerned right now about some of the legislation that the federal government has introduced, often described as censorious, that it is seeking to organize and centralize more power with the federal bureaucracy to determine what Canadians can see and hear online, and consequently what they can say online. Thinking of legislation like Bill C-11, Bill C-18, for example, I'm curious if you empathize with Canadians who see that and have concerns over that centralization of power here in Ottawa that can affect how Canadians will express themselves across the country.
I think that human beings in general are always suspicious of government power. That's kind of a trait that we all share and are inclined to worry about any interventions that might curb their individual freedoms. I'm not an expert on the communications law that you referred to. Ms. Laidlaw would be a more appropriate expert on that. It's important to note that while people often feel threatened by government interventions, wise government interventions aim to actually protect people and to protect their freedoms. And I'm not an expert on whether these laws do that or not, but I can certainly sympathize with people's worries, right?
Well, you did mention in your opening statement some concerns over what you described as authoritarian decisions by governments. And I do think a lot of Canadians view what the current Liberal government is doing with this legislation as an authoritarian streak, an attempt to control what Canadians can see and hear online and consequently what they can say. So my question to you would be, is it legitimate, in your view, for Canadians to have concerns over governments trying to exercise power and control over their expression?
Well, it really depends on the details of the power and control. So I'll take, for example, the federal government's current fight with Facebook and X. Every day I hear Canadians complaining about their inability to access news through social media. On the other hand, the reason for that legislation is to try to get profits into the hands of independent Canadian journalism outlets so that they can continue to do the job of journalism rather than having those profits entirely reaped by non-Canadian multi-billionaires, right?
So if a student on your campus said, well, I really wish I could see news on Instagram, but I can't because of decisions Justin Trudeau has made, you would say, trust the government?
I would say go to the library because we have every Canadian news outlet in the library online and in hard copy. Go directly to the news sources and seek your information from Canadian journalism, not from American social media.
I see. So you would say that the attempts to organize activists, people who are concerned about issues in their country, who do rely on social media as a way to get information and also as a way to communicate their concerns, that they should just go to the library and accept what Justin Trudeau has done.
That's clearly not what I said. Social media turns out to be very useful for organizing protests and so forth, and it continues to be useful for that. You can't share a newspaper article, but mostly protests aren't organized around the sharing of newspaper articles. You create events, you create discussion boards and so forth. The limitations are actually pretty...
Is there an extent to which the trust in government that you seem to be articulating, that they somehow, this government here in Ottawa, accumulating power and control, has these very nice motives? Is there an extent to which it would be fair to acknowledge that Canadians are right to be skeptical of that, and that when they do open up Instagram and cannot access the news, they should be concerned that there are bureaucrats in Ottawa that really want to determine what they're able to see and not see?
I think Canadians are right to be skeptical of political activities in general, because that skeptical attitude and the desire to seek good information in order to deliberate and make good decisions makes us better citizens. So no matter who's in government, we ought to approach the actions of government with caution.
And would you say then that attempts by a government to control and censor what people can say do deserve critical thinking and response, do deserve serious questions, and that it is right, as a person who said in your opening statement you're concerned about authoritarian exercises of power, that maybe Canadians do have a point when they say that this is a censorious streak that deserves serious attention?
All legislation deserves critical thinking and attention by citizens. I don't agree that trying to support the profits of independent Canadian journalistic outlets
censorship
is
as long as
censorious.
raising funds for a purpose
Thank you,
you like is
Mr.
okay.
Giovanni. Thank you, Dr. Day. We'll move now to the Liberals for 5 minutes. Ms. Latanzio, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question would be addressed to Professor Diaz. So you've touched briefly on this in your opening statement, but can you tell us a little bit more about the impacts of the far-right discourses and how they've marginalized students and communities on university campuses?
And I would commend to you the research of Jeffrey Sachs, who's a political scientist at Acadia University. Dr. Sachs has been for years now researching censorious reprisal and discipline against academic staff in North America. Over the course of his research, he has found that, in fact, very, very few academic staff actually have been terminated because of their expression or their views, but overwhelmingly, those who have been terminated have been on the left. And it's very interesting because there is a campaign by groups in the U.S. to characterize the left as censorious and as threatening the expression and scholarship of conservative scholars, but it's not actually borne out by the evidence when you look at the longitudinal analysis that Dr. Sachs has provided.
Okay, and in your opinion, does the political support and the propping up of similar speeches, such as we saw Mr. Poilievre and many of his members of his caucus do with the Freedom Convoy and other far-right groups, would that have a similar impact on freedom of speech and freedom of expression for marginalized communities, in your opinion?
I think that people are more influenced, honestly, by social media and by their neighbors' opinions than they are by political speech. I think that, there's a risk that when people in position of power engage in polarizing speech that makes its way onto social media, that can further polarize and disinform the public, but I think it's kind of by an indirect route.
Okay. Professor Laidlaw, as you know, the Conservatives have unfortunately been stalling the debate on C-63, the Online Harms Act, in the House with their ongoing filibuster. Why is this harmful to freedom of speech?
That's a great question. And, Bill C-63 deserves debate and it deserves attention. No matter what we've seen today in our discussions, that technology is at the center of all these discussions about freedom of expression, and this is the first step. And Canada, again, is decades behind other jurisdictions in addressing this particular issue. And so that debate needs to happen, and we want to hear from all voices on it. And so I'm quite eager to see this to get to committee, and I would encourage every elected official in the room now to encourage it to go to committee as well, to have that important study and debate.
And you mentioned other countries having adopted this same kind of mechanism. You mentioned Australia and other companies. What would be in Bill C-63? What are the similarities that you find in the proposed legislation and other countries who have adopted the same law?
Yes. So the key similarity is a focus on risk management by social media companies, which again is a kind of second generation, best in class approach to addressing online harms and protecting freedom of expression. So that's the approach in the EU, and that's the approach in the UK and Australia, Ireland. Other countries are following suit as well. There's only a few types of content that require content removal, which would have the greatest impact on free expression. And I think we can all get around that one. It's child sexual abuse, material and non-consensual disclosure of intimate images. So it's quite a carefully thought out legislation. Again, I would make some amendments to it, but the structure is there.
What type of amendments would you make?
I would make one key amendment, which is that as part of risk management, a private company should look at not just harms, but they should look at the ways that they protect and promote freedom of expression and privacy in particular. So as part of the transparency obligations of that company, they should set out what they do so that they can say, this is how I balance things out when I'm thinking through issues such as hate and incitement to violence.
Thank you. Ms. Grant, in your opinion,
Quickly.
what is your, okay, so what is the importance of having a free and independent press and ensuring freedom of speech and freedom of expression? And how does misinformation and disinformation play a role in diminishing or affecting people's ability to express themselves freely?
Quick answer, please.
Media expression is so important for our democracy because the right to freedom of expression also includes the right to receive information. And we need that information in order to hold government accountable, in order to participate in democracy. So it facilitates that. And we really
Okay, thank you very much. We're over time. We're moving now to Mr. Shampoo for 2.5 minutes. Go ahead.
Merci. Madame Grant, je continue avec vous.
Thank you, Ms. Grant. I'll continue with you. You were referring to freedom of expression being limited or coming under attack in protests, for instance, pro-Palestinian protests. So in that example, there were pro-Hamas elements in the protest, and there were chants about the destruction of Israel. So do you think that that could have justified a more harsh police intervention, for instance, when that happens?
The BCCLA supports the rights of protesters as long as it's not hate speech, right? Hate speech is criminal. And calling for the freedom of any people is calling for freedom. So I'm you know, there has been, sure, there can be different interpretations, but in our perspective, if people said free Indigenous people in Canada, it doesn't mean they're going to kill the rest of us.
Étant donné que dans de nombreuses manifestations,
given that in many protests we heard extremely hateful, extremely violent rhetoric and slogans, I just wanted to underline that. I have another question for you, Ms. Grant. Do you think that the security of other groups in the society that are impacted by conflicts that are going on at the moment, and especially the one that's between Israel and Hamas, do you think that the security of other groups that are concerned should take precedence over the protesters at the protest, for instance? Because I'll refer you to what happened at Concordia University. Jewish students were pushed around by people who were still under they were still under the mood, if you will, of the moment of the protests that were going on. So do you think that people's security should take the priority over the freedom of expression in such a case?
I'm not sure what the specific example you're referring to, but overall, Palestine solidarity protests have been overwhelmingly peaceful in Canada. There's been very few examples.
Madame Grant,
and there is proportionate police response that can happen to ensure people's safety. No one is disagreeing with that.
D'accord. Je vous parlais d'événements très précis.
I was referring to a very specific incident, and if you are following news and following it very, very closely, I don't think that what happened is something that you would have missed. But thank you for the answers you provided. Thank you, Chair.
Shampoo, we move to Mr. Desjardins for 2.5 minutes. Fire away.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank my colleagues again for undertaking this important work, and thank you to the witnesses for supplying what I believe to be very good expert testimony that will definitely assist and surely assist our analysts in production of a very good report. I do want to focus and spend time now on a situation that arises from my experience, my direct lived experience in community in Edmonton-Griesbach. I represent a great deal of many concerned citizens who've both exercised their rights, their freedom of expression rights, while also attempting to balance that with the very important need to bring more people into what is a larger discussion. Any democratic society would hope to see that. An idea flourish to become a popular opinion, to see that become and formulate good policy, hopefully good moral and sound policy. What I heard from my constituents, and what I think I hear right across the country, is activists are feeling very nervous They're feeling they're walking on eggshells. We have Palestinian families that are crying out injustice, and they need to be seen. It's only Canadian to look to our neighbors and to support them in any way, in every best way we can. Allies, progressive Jewish people across our country right now are asking for nuance and for the ability of us to be able to hold two things at once, the very needed and important pursuit of justice for all people, while also ensuring that we balance our democratic mission and our rights to freedom of expression. I had heard from my constituents, which were student activists that were engaged in the encampment at the University of Alberta, that got beaten. They showed me the scars, the bruises, the wounds that they had endured just simply for speaking truth to power, or whether it was Palestinian families or organizations like the Cultural Palestinian Association of Canada, which is headquartered in Edmonton. They're seeing reports of people in their workplaces, regular workplaces, being targeted, being left, and being terminated for simply speaking truth to power. Now, Grant, you probably heard the testimony given by Dr. G. You mentioned Dr. G. And he mentioned that he faced attacks, and he believes that those attacks were direct influence on other people deciding not to speak up. Do you think that's the nature of why the police are cracking down on so much of this, and maybe is a motivator behind anti-Palestinian racism?
I do, because policing reflects the systemic inequalities we have in our society and maintains those systems of oppression. And mischaracterizing globally Palestine solidarity as terrorism or as hate is part of the trend we are seeing. It's known and documented as anti-Palestinian racism and the Palestine exception to freedom of expression. So when policing in Canada is responding disproportionately, because no one's saying that policing can't respond proportionately.
Thank you, Ms. Grant. I got to move on. We're over. So what we're going to do, we have 2 5-minute rounds left, and then we're going to take a break. So the 5-minute rounds will go to the Conservatives and the Liberals. Mr. Couric for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and appreciate the testimony offered here today. And certainly I find it fascinating that the Liberals would try to make an issue of the fact that for now, 5 weeks, they refuse to release documents that is delaying government business from taking place in the House of Commons. Wouldn't it be simple if they would just offer the basic level of accountability? Ms. Laidlaw, my question that I hope you can shed some light on is when it comes to the where government is and the power that government wields, especially in terms of regulation. You mentioned, I believe, in your opening statement about shadowy, and I forget exactly, but shadows in regards to algorithm and the lack of transparency that exists in that. And certainly I know that I hear often just a lack of trust in from Canadians when it comes to algorithms, when it comes to government's involvement in that. Do you share concern that it seems through, whether it's Bill C-11, Bill C-18, that there seems to be a consolidation of the ability for government to get involved in what Canadians see online? Do you share concerns? And if so, could you outline a little bit what those concerns are in regards to C-11 and C-18 and anything else that the government is proposing that would send a chill about Canadians' guaranteed right to freedom of expression and freedom of speech?
Yes, thank you for the question. Because I think that the answer is somewhat complicated, which is that, one of the reasons that we have, the charter right to freedom of expression is to protect us also from government overreach, right? I think that the complicating factor is that how we enjoy freedom of expression, the right to seek, receive, and impart information, is happening more and more through different sources and through private parties. And we've always had laws in those spaces, both to protect freedom of expression and protect us from harm. And in the area of technology law, Canada is woefully behind other jurisdictions on all fronts. So, in my opinion, we do need laws because the issue of technology accountability, algorithmic regulation, protection of users. We do require laws, but it matters the type of law. So for there to be some nervousness about what government is doing and how they do it, that absolutely we should be nervous about that. I was not supportive about Bill C-11 and the social media rules, but I am when it comes to Bill C-63. So I think it just depends on the law.
If I could, just because time is short, one of the things about Bill C-63 that I find really concerning is we have in Canada right now a very objective measure of what hate speech is. And I've heard from constituents that look at what the government has proposed and say that it now becomes very objective, that offense becomes one of the new metrics to which whether something is or is not hate speech can be measured. And certainly when it comes to the subjective nature of what somebody feels is offensive, and I'll use an example for myself. I support the Canadian oil and gas sector. There are Liberals that have called that opinion something that is offensive and filled with hate. And while I struggle to grasp that, and we may share differences of opinions on that matter, the subjective nature to which the Liberals are proposing amendments to hate speech legislation, do you find that concerning, and how it could be weaponized against specific groups in this country if there's no longer that objective measure and it becomes subjective based on somebody's opinions or, quite frankly, their feelings?
Yeah, and I think that it's always been hard when it comes to hate speech, because the tendency is for people to look at other values and say, oh, well, I approve of freedom of expression when it comes to what I think. I will say this. I think that there are some significant problems with parts 2 and 3 in Bill C-63 that do need to be addressed. The definition of hate, though, does draw from Supreme Court jurisprudence, and I'd encourage everyone to go read the paragraphs, because the paragraphs are actually more fulsome and do set out quite a high threshold. Could there still be problems in interpretation and application? Absolutely, because it's so contextual. But it is drawing from case law, so it is drawing from a legal framework.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll move now to the Liberals. Ms. Dillon for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. My questions will be for Mrs. D. I'm going to start with saying, first of all, it looks like our conservative colleagues now have a problem with libraries. You were talking about how important it is to get independent news from Canadian sources, and you can go to a library to do that. And before you were cut off, can you finish your thought that you had on Canadians being able to get news that is more Canadian-centric from a library, to use their own brain and their own, I think, analytical skills to know what's what, please?
It isn't about Canadian-centric news. It's about news researched by journalists who are trained to seek truth, right? Citizen journalism, even when well-intentioned, can be a source of misinformation. When it is ill-intentioned, it can be a source of disinformation. We need trained journalists in the journalism sector, both in Canada and internationally, in order to get the truths to citizens, right? And journalism doesn't happen for free. The sector needs to be able to profit enough that it can hire those trained journalists and run their operations. Over the years, the sharing of journalistic content by third-party providers without any compensation to the journalism sources themselves has crippled the journalism sector and made it very, very difficult for that truth-seeking to occur. There needs to be some kind of compensation for the experts who are actually out there sourcing the news and helping us to be well-informed citizens.
Thank you so much for clarifying that about trained journalists. And these are huge topics with all the changes that are happening on social media. WhatsApp is now being used as a news source, and a lot of our news is being affected by foreign interference. This is just a whole nother ball game. Can you please quickly, because I have another question, do a survol? Thank you so much.
Thank you. I have a colleague in at my university, Dr. Brian McQuinn, who specifically researches the use of social media for political polarization that leads to violence and conflict, and it is very real. Social media is increasingly becoming a mechanism for violence and conflict.
Thank you so much. And we have our conservative colleagues talking about so-called government censorship and blaming everything on Justin Trudeau. This is a huge part of the problem for him being now attacked the way he is. Quickly, this so-called censorship that they're talking about, I have a quote for you, and maybe you can tell me what kind of freedom of expression this is. It's very vulgar, so but I'm sure you'll understand. Is this freedom of expression? You could start by effing off to whatever shithole your parents came from, back to the streets your mom and dad sucked D on to make money to come to this great country and give birth to a POS bad woman part like you. These are messages myself and my colleagues are getting. What do you think of this freedom of expression?
I would defer to Ms. Laidlaw. Intuitively, to me, that sounds like borders on hate speech, but I'm not a legal expert, and so that's only my opinion.
And do you think such words, such attacks are permissible? Do you not think the whole purpose of our online harms legislation is to protect people who are vulnerable?
Is lawful, then it is legally permissible. That doesn't make it morally permissible. That's a separate matter. What you've just described is immoral. Whether it's illegal or not is a question for lawyers.
Thank you so much. I think my time is up.
This is here in the first round. Dr. Day, Ms. Laidlaw, along with Ms. Grant, thank you very much. So we'll take a 10-minute break and we'll come back. The game plan here would be we'll have 2 live witnesses, one on Zoom. So the game plan is to come back at about 25 after 12 and go to about 10 to 2 so we can get to the House in time, okay? So we'll suspend and come back in about 10 minutes' time. everyone. We're going to resume our second hour, and I'd like to welcome our new witnesses. Michael Geist, Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-Commerce Law, Faculty of Law, University of Ottawa. Online is Kathleen Mahoney, Professor of Law, and with us in person, Canadian Media Guild, is Anik Forrest, who is the President. Welcome. I think most of you have been here before. So 5 minutes, opening comments. And after that, we'll have questions and answers. First up, Mr. Geist, welcome again. You have 5 minutes.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon. My name is Michael Geist. I'm a law professor at the University of Ottawa, where I hold the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-Commerce Law. I appear in a personal capacity representing only my own views. I'd like to start by emphasizing that freedom of expression is rightly and widely recognized as foundational to robust, accountable, inclusive democracy. That said, there's always a balance to be struck. I'm sure we would all agree that there are limits where expression is viewed as so harmful that it should be restricted or rendered unlawful. Obvious examples include child pornography, defamation, and terrorism-related offenses. The difficulty generally doesn't lie with those kinds of cases. I'd like to focus on two cases that are much tougher: digital policy and the challenge of when expression chills other expression. First, digital policy. Bills C11, C18, C63, and S210 all intersect with expression either directly or indirectly. The direct examples are C63 and S210. These bills by design have expression implications. C63 identifies 7 harms that are defined as a kind of content, but each is a form of expression. This expression can cause harm: revenge porn, inciting terror, or bullying, for example. While I have some enforcement concerns, I think the bill identifies real harms and, at least in part, seeks to establish a balance in addressing them. More problematic are the Criminal Code and Human Rights Act provisions that are overbroad, may weaponize the human rights system, and have a chilling effect. Bill S210 is even more direct in limiting expression, as it literally provides for federal court blocking orders of lawful content, and it envisions Canadian internet providers to do the blocking. This is a dangerous bill that should go back to the drawing board. I think Bills C11 and C18 both have indirect effects on expression. In the case of C11, supporters were far too dismissive of the implications of regulating user content, with some going so far as to deny it was in the bill, only to later issue a policy direction that confirmed its presence. C18 not only led to the blocking of news links, but it failed to recognize that linking to content is itself expression. The net effect has been to cause harm to news-related expression in Canada. We need to do better when it comes to digital policy, as we haven't always taken the protection of expression sufficiently seriously in the digital policy debate. Second, there is expression that chills other expression. This can occur where expression includes harassment or strikes fear in some communities, invariably leading to a chill in their ability to express themselves. My own community, the Jewish community, is a case in point, as the rise in anti-Semitism in a manner not seen in Canada in generations has sparked fear, safety fears, and chilled expression. No group has faced and been the target of more hate crimes than the Jewish community. On campuses, this manifests itself with students and faculty concealing their identity by hiding their religion, political beliefs, or fearing speaking out in class. I'm wearing a Bring the Hostages Home pin today, a form of expression, but many would be reluctant to do so on our streets and campuses. Encampments, graffiti, vandalism, doxing, online threats, the abandonment of institutional neutrality, and the exclusion of those who believe in Zionism from classes or parts of campus have become too commonplace and have had a corrosive effect on those targeted and undermined their expression rights. Universities, workplaces, and other communities have long recognized the harm of expression chilling other expression. It's why we have codes designed to ensure not just physical safety, but freedom from abusive or demeaning conduct that constitutes harassment and may limit the expression of others. In a committee focused on protecting freedom of expression, there are many things that can be done. Ensuring we have clearly defined policies, such as the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, active enforcement of campus policies and codes, principled implementation of institutional neutrality, and leadership in speaking out against conduct that creates fear and chills speech. In our broader communities, time and place restrictions, such as those included in the court ruling involving the encampment at the University of Toronto, preserve both the rights of those who want to protest and those for whom the encampment created real harms and chilled their expression. Similarly, bubble zone legislation to safeguard schools, community centers, and places of worship strikes a much-needed balance. This past year has served as a wake-up call for many. Taking action against hate enhances expression rather than detracting from it, and we must all do our part in this fight. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Geist, we'll move now to Ms. Mahoney, Emeritus Professor of Law, for 5 minutes, please. Your mic, please turn your mic on. There you go.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm very pleased to be here and honored to be here. It's been quite some time since I've had the opportunity to speak on this topic, so I welcome it. What I've provided you with is a rather dated paper, but I did that quite deliberately because I think what's important here is that first principles must guide the discussion and guide the thinking on these topics. So my presentation is going to go back to first principles, and I'm going to talk about them in that context. Hate discrimination has evolved, as we know, into a global phenomenon. It's amplified by technological advancements that disseminate hate speech across borders instantaneously. Once limited to local acts, hate now targets individuals and groups worldwide, undermining personal security, equality, and even national peace. This necessitates a nuanced approach to balancing rights such as free speech and equality, a word I haven't heard mentioned in the last hour or so, under both domestic and international law. Gender-based violence, abuse, and harassment has been very pronounced in the technological developments I've mentioned. The key concepts and frameworks here I'm going to talk about in terms of definition and process, harmful impact, and international legal obligations. Hate discrimination, it's very important to understand, follows a progression, starting with the identification of a group, moving to discrimination on the basis of immutable traits, and societal dehumanization. It manifests itself in speech, in acts, in systemic violence, ranging from exclusionary practices right up to genocidal assaults. Far from mere expression, it is a harmful act in itself. This is critical to any discussion of expression, is that expression can become and often is an act as well as expression. Historical examples like the Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide, and other atrocities highlight the role of hate speech in inciting ultimate violence. Modern statistics underscore its prevalence. Rising hate crimes globally are enabled now by digital platforms that bypass traditional jurisdictional limits. Treaties like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights require states like Canada to prohibit hate speech that incites violence or discrimination. So balancing competing rights of free expression and protection of harm is central to all frameworks. Now, in the Canadian context, we have taken a dual legal approach because Canada employs both criminal and civil laws to address hate discrimination. Criminal provisions target the most egregious acts, such as incitement to genocide, while civil remedies focus on preventing and rectifying discrimination. The Supreme Court of Canada has affirmed that hate speech regulation is compatible with constitutional rights, emphasizing that equality and security are as crucial as freedom of expression. Challenges in the digital age are the rapid spread of hate online and Canada's inclusion of internet hate provisions, which demonstrate a commitment to adapting our laws for emerging platforms. Broader implications are that hate discrimination is not just a societal issue, But as been said in the earlier session today, it's a threat to democracy and national security. My paper argues for a balanced, principled approach to maximize freedoms while curbing the corrosive effects of hate. Now, just to remind you of the seminal legal decisions, I'm going to quickly describe them. The Keekstra case was in 1990, 34 years ago. And the context there was where a high school teacher promoted anti-Semitic views in his classroom, requiring students to list and learn his hate ideas. The court upheld the criminal code provision when Mr. Keekstra challenged it, prohibiting the willful promotion of hatred against identifiable groups. I personally have been involved in all of the leading hate speech cases, so this is why I have emphasized them. The significance of the Keekstra case was that the majority ruled that hate speech regulation does align with Section 1 of the Charter. While it limits freedom of expression, this limitation is wholly justified to protect individuals and groups from the harmful effects of hate speech, which in that case was identified as their equality rights, which are also protected in the Charter. The
Thank
court
you.
noted that hate speech...
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Mahoney. We're over 5 minutes for you. So we'll move on to the Canadian Media Guild. The president is with us, Annick Forrest. Go ahead, Ms. Forrest.
Thank you for giving the Canadian Media Guild the opportunity to comment on the means the Canadian government should have at its disposal to ensure freedom of expression in the country. Now, freedom of press and other media of communication was enshrined in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms because it's essential to guaranteeing Canadians' fundamental right to the freedom of conceive and express ideas, together with others to discuss them and to disseminate them. Canadians' freedom of expression, therefore, depends on the freedom of the press. So let's talk about the freedom of the press. The freedom of the press exists when the media ecosystem includes multiple independent, diversified media that receive and transmit information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of the medium, and thus contribute to nourishing and shaping public opinion, which is an essential element of democratic debate. For freedom of the press, and therefore freedom of expression, to exist in Canada, we need a healthy media ecosystem, and for this media ecosystem to be healthy, the Canadian government must have certain means at its disposal. The government must have the means to ensure a solid foundation for our media ecosystem. This solid foundation begins with a sustainable funding model for our public broadcaster, stable, long-term funding that adjusts to current economic realities, and a funding model that ensures the public broadcaster to have a sufficient budget to fulfill the mandate given to it by Canadians. Now, why do I put the emphasis on sustainable funding for the public broadcaster? Well, because they have the mandate to support Canadians in exercising their fundamental rights, their freedom of thought, belief and expression, their freedom to conceive and express ideas, and their freedom to gather with other people to discuss and disseminate these ideas. Now, why is long-term funding important? Well, because the freedom of expression of Canadians, that Canadians enjoy rather through freedom of the press, should in no way be influenced by the political vagaries of Parliament Hill. Stable long-term funding for the public broadcaster is one more way for the Canadian government to demonstrate that CBC Radio Canada is indeed a public broadcaster and not a state broadcaster. A budget commensurate with the public broadcaster's mandate is essential if all Canadians are to have equitable access to the freedom of expression provided by the media. The democratic discourse of Canadians is not complete when it does not include the concerns of farmers in Saskatchewan, hunters in Iqaluit, outfitters in the Yukon, and fishermen in Yarmouth, Steveston, Kokan, or Kapamul. To avoid an imbalance in Canada's democratic discourse, journalists must be present in as many communities as possible. In this way, the government can act to give a voice to Canadians whose message runs counter to the popular discourse, to Canadians who belong to minority groups, and to Canadians who live far from areas of influence. In this vein, the Canadian Media Guild believes that to guarantee freedom of expression for Indigenous peoples, the federal government should also provide the continued existence of a media outlet designed and managed by members of these communities. One media outlet is not enough to ensure freedom of expression in this country. The more media outlets there are, the more Canadians will be able to express themselves. So the government must therefore take steps to ensure that ownership of the country's private media is not concentrated in the hands of a few or held by players outside our borders. Press freedom also means protecting journalists. The government must equip itself with the means to better protect journalists in the performance of their duties.
It's become more common for media workers to be verbally or physically abused by bystanders while in the field, but some are also now being personally attacked by influential figures when they try to hold them to account. When influential members of society models these unacceptable behaviors, it opens the door for others to follow. The consequence can be a form of self-censorship on the part of some journalists, and this is another, though less obvious, limitation of freedom of the press. Pour informer le discours démocratique, les journalistes obligent les...
To better inform debate and the democratic discourse, journalists hold those in power to account. When the system isn't self-correcting, those who witness situations that undermine Canada's democracy should be able to disclose the state of affairs without fear of reprisal. The government must strengthen the protection of whistleblowers to better protect them.
To be held accountable for their acts are the first to target journalists. Impunity comes with the absence of witnesses. In December 2019, the Canadian government co-sponsored the most recent UN General Assembly resolution on the safety of journalists. The Canadian Media Guild believes the protection of freedom of expression for media workers is best served if Canada follows through with what is proposed in this resolution.
Thank you, Ms. Forrest. We'll move on. That's 5 minutes. A 6-minute round. The opening round is always 6 minutes. We'll start with the Conservative Party. Mr. Giovanni, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Geist, thanks for being with us today. I'd like to ask you some questions about digital policy, in particular about some of the legislation that many Canadians have called Justin Trudeau's censorship agenda. Some of the legislation you referred to, C11, C18, for example. You know, C11 gets misrepresented by Liberals here in Ottawa very often as an attempt to push back on big businesses, big corporations, social media companies, you know, American influence. But you wisely pointed out that in a policy directive, they did make clear that included in Bill C11 is a measure of regulating user-generated content. I'd like for you to elaborate on why that's significant and why Canadians should be concerned about that being included in a Liberal policy directive.
Well, this is deja vu all over again, as I had a chance to peer the committee on that bill. And you know, I think the core of the bill, it does involve the notion of trying to bring large streaming services into the Canadian broadcasting framework, and we're seeing how some of that plays out before the CRTC now with, I think, some real concerns, frankly, about consumers ultimately paying the price on some of the increased costs. But with respect to the inclusion of user-generated content, the policy directive actually directs the CRTC not to regulate users, and the CRTC has followed that. But throughout the process, there were continual denials that this even existed in the legislation, when I think it was readily apparent to just about everybody that it did. And the concern there was that some of the powers that were vested in the regulator could have an impact on the expression rights of those creators. Noting now that the policy direction says, don't do this, but the legislation at least opened the door to things like elevating through algorithms certain content over other content. And what you had were many digital creators, Canadian digital creators, who made the case that they were finding success online and were deeply concerned that having a regulator step in and have an impact in terms of how their stuff would appear on some of these large platforms could have an impact on their livelihood and what Canadians are able to see.
So the fact that the legislation opened the door, to use your phrasing, for the federal government to regulate user-generated content, what is the significance of that in your view? And also, do you think that the concerns raised during the process about the possibility of that regulation over user-generated content were appropriately weighed in the process of putting this legislation forward?
Well, I should note that the legislation actually initially did not include this, include user content. It was during clause by clause of an earlier iteration of the bill that the bill was changed to remove an exception that had previously excluded it. I think the concerns were real. In fact, once the bill left this committee and left the House and went to the Senate conducted extensive hearings on that same bill and actually proposed an amendment to try to directly address that issue. I thought it was unfortunate that government or the House ultimately rejected that proposed amendment, sent it through as they did, and now have been forced essentially, if they really do want to exclude user content, to put this in a policy direction. So for the moment, the policy direction rules, but a policy direction, of course, doesn't have the same kind of power that legislation does, and I think that's why many had raised this issue. Sometimes we're told there was really nothing to be concerned about, and yet the reality was it was quite clearly there, and there were easy fixes, quite frankly, that I think would have maintained the policy objectives that the government and other groups had, while at the same time ensuring that there were better safeguards about including user content within the scope of the law.
When Canadians see this pattern of legislation that's been put forward by the current government, I think that a lot of the time they're being gaslit by the Liberal government to not be concerned, to sort of downplay what are legitimate concerns about concentration of power in the hands of bureaucracies to control what Canadians can see and hear online and consequently what they can say online. When you see those attempts to sort of say to Canadians, don't worry about it, like don't even raise a red flag, like trust the government, how do you respond to that phenomenon we're observing here in Ottawa?
Well, I suppose that at the end of the day, my concern here, and I mentioned it in my opening, was that I don't think we've taken the expression-related issues seriously enough as part of the digital policy. And I should be clear, this isn't just about C11 and C18. The opposition parties, unlike the government, has been supporting S210, which raises real expression rights as well. So I'm not sure that anybody comes here with fully clean hands about addressing some of those kinds of issues. I wish that all parties would take more seriously some of these issues, and to your point about gaslighting, when there are voices, sometimes voices that aren't the typical people that appear before committee raising these kinds of concerns, that those concerns are taken more seriously, because I think there was a sense amongst many that simply wasn't the case through the process in C11.
Would you say that there is an appropriate amount of concern as you observe this legislation, any one of the four that you mentioned, as you see that legislation before, do you see an appropriate amount of concern over state overreach? Do you think that that's something that needs to be emphasized more?
I think we always need to be cognizant of what it means to have government intervene in this way. I think we are, as you heard in your earlier panel, increasingly appreciating the concern of overreach from platforms as well, and that's part of what we're trying to grapple with here. But sometimes as we venture into some of these newer spaces and these newer kinds of regulation, you often get new voices come forward as well, and there's at times been a bit of a reticence to include some of those kinds of perspectives as part of the discussion, or perhaps even as part of the policy development.
Could you be more specific in terms of the perspectives?
He can, but another round.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Koto for the Liberal Party for 6 minutes. Michael?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our participants today. Our guest from the Canadian Media Guild said in conclusion and then didn't have the ability to finish. Do you want to just take 30 seconds and conclude?
Opportunity to do that, and I will do so. So, in conclusion, to ensure freedom of the press, Canadian media workers must not fear for their physical, mental, or financial safety.
Perfect. That was 10 seconds. I appreciate it. I thought, Miss Mahoney, your presentation used a term that I think really sums up a lot of the challenges we have with freedom of expression as a whole, and that's there has to be a balance between equality and safety and the freedom of expression. I think it's if I heard you correctly, I believe that's what you said, but we have to admit that this issue is not just a one-sided issue. There are, safety and equity and equality concerns, but also finding that balance between not taking away someone's ability to express themselves. I think it is a very sophisticated, very challenging discussion that one has to embark on. in order to, to really, I would say, find a balance. On the weekend, I saw on social media, I think it was in Columbus, Ohio, there was a march of neo-Nazis with flags, and they're using all these words. And, I was thinking, like, yes, they're expressing themselves, but to what extent, and what kind of safety issues are, and how people are feeling. So can you talk a little bit about, the challenge of that balance, just as a society as a whole? You're on mute.
The question is a very good one, and thank you for it. I think this is really an important area to keep in mind. The courts were very clear that Canada is has a unique way of protecting rights. We not only have freedom of expression, but it's not a paramount freedom. It has to be read with the others, and this is what makes Canada special. We have Section 27 that says we protect multiculturalism, and that's an interpretive device. We have Section 15 that has 4 equality guarantees: equality for and under the law, and equal benefit, and equal protection of the law. And we can't see freedom of expression in isolation. And that even comes up in Bill 163, for example. There's a portion of that bill that talks about freedom of expression, that we have to be very careful not to make unreasonable restraints on freedom of expression. But it seems to me then that provision should also say we have to be very careful about protecting the equality of the people who are targeted by these hateful or very harmful expressions. And so I think in order to maintain what the Supreme Court of Canada has taught us in a series of freedom of expression cases, is that equality is as important as freedom of expression. Freedom of expression cannot dominate the other rights. Otherwise, that's when you get in these problems of children and women and other marginalized groups, Indigenous peoples, suffering from their lack of access to the megaphone. They don't have the billions that are invested in media. They don't have the political sway that others do in order to express themselves. And so that's what's very, very important, it seems to me. And I think Bill 163, although there's some laudable provisions in it, in my opinion, doesn't go far enough.
And I'm going to ask you a question that may even sound a bit naive from my side, but what does it mean when someone says they should have the ability to express themselves?
Well, sure, people should have it, and that's why we have Section 2B in the Charter. Of course, it's a pillar of democracy. They must be able to express themselves, but they have to take into account the effects of their speech on others who have equal rights that perhaps cannot express themselves for any variety of reasons. And that's what makes a good democracy. That's the point that's missing in a lot of these totally focused on expression arguments that don't take into account the people who are targeted by very political, negative, hateful expression that wants to diminish those people's right to participate in democracy.
And it's almost
that's the democratic, underlying.
And it's interesting you say that, because one of the biggest challenges today in democracy is that we have become so polarized. Where everyone's on the opposite end of the debate. And we need to find ways to look at it from both perspectives. I think it's really important as a foundational kind of approach to this discussion, is that, in order to have a good democracy and to ensure the ability for people to express themselves, you have to keep in mind, concepts like equality and the public safety and the public good. These are important factors, I believe, also in preserving a good democracy. Now, I keep hearing, folks out there who say Canada has, we've gone in a bad direction, and people's rights are being taken away, and their ability to freedom. You hear this on social media all the time, but everywhere I look, Canada always fits into the top 10% of countries in the world where people have the best rights when it comes to expression. Would you agree with that?
I tend to agree with that, yes. I think that that Canada has set itself apart from being not a democracy of the loudest, but a democracy that tries to take into account the views of the wide population, and trying to have the kind of engagement with portions of the population that don't have the access to the megaphone so to speak, the megaphone of mass media or the megaphone of social media and all of
Thank you, Ms. Mahoney. We're going to move on. We're past our 6 minutes. Mr. Shampoo for the block for 6 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Once again, I'd like to thank our witnesses who are with us today. Professor Geist, you piqued my curiosity when you referred to C63. I think we would really enjoy a discussion on that bill because I think it contains good things, but there are also aspects of it that might be looked into. So, but I was surprised about your comments about the bill. So, should we just scrap it altogether? Should it go back to the drawing board? But in C63, there's something that's striking for me. There is a section that allows people to report others on the sole suspicion that they could be about to say something hateful or do something. What do you think is the element that led to the insertion of a section of that caliber in that bill?
Okay, thanks for that. First, I want to preface by making clear when I said legislation needs to be going back to the drawing board, I was actually referring to Bill S210, which is the age verification bill that includes the blocking that I referred to and a number of other issues. C63 needs to go to committee. And I think that it's really in some ways two bills in one. There is the element that is the larger part of online harms, which deals specifically with the responsibility of the internet platforms. And I think there's a lot that can be worked with there. I have some concerns about the enforcement mechanisms have been established, but I think there's a lot that's there. What you are referring to, though, sorry, quickly, my apologies, is the criminal code provisions, and in particular an attempt to create essentially the equivalent of a peace bond for speech in this context. Now, we use these kinds of things in other contexts, right? If we're concerned about domestic violence, we might, and it's imminent, we might get an order to ensure that that doesn't happen or try to prevent that from taking place. This would be similarly an attempt to prevent certain kinds of potentially hate from taking place. If, as I mentioned off the top, Jewish community has seen an unprecedented number of shootings and targets at synagogues and at schools. If we knew that that was coming, then a bond might be able to try to stop some of those kinds of activities from taking place. I think, though, and Professor Laidlaw mentioned this before, both the Criminal Code and the Human Rights Act provisions that are in the legislation run the risk of overreach, and frankly, the bill should be split, and we should be focusing on the internet stuff and leave this other stuff for a separate study.
On est d'accord là-dessus. Merci. J'ai sûrement une autre question pour vous.
We do agree on that. I have another question on C63, but I also would like to turn to Ms. Faure. You talked about journalism and the current climate that applies to journalism, traditional journalism, if you wish, because it used to be that they were bound by certain principles and rules as per the profession, but now we are seeing that journalism is being transformed and drastically. There's militant journalism, younger journalists, for instance, graduating school these days, they are a lot more engaged and they want to take part in a more engaged type of journalism. And they do that in ways that line up with their values and engagement criteria, if you will. So is that a risk for the profession of journalism, or are we able to protect traditional journalism? You referred to Radio-Canada CBC, that plays an essential role in terms of coverage. So what do you think about the new tendencies, new trends? Well, regardless of the type of journalism, I think the essential point is transparency in all of this. We have to clearly state our allegiances because if you have a journalism that engages in the apology of something or something else, because that is in line with their values that are known, that's one thing. But otherwise, if you're a journalist, you should be responsible and you should be open to being held accountable in terms of what you produce and put out. So that's true. Those are facts. But is it journalism at that point? If someone is declaring openly a position, is it still considered journalism, or is it just commentary? What do you think? Because it's this trend that confuses people, because people think, okay, it's journalism, but it's also one person's opinion. But journalism needs to be neutral and objective. So what do you think about that? Well, I'll go back to the idea of transparency. So journalism, if you hold the mic to everyone and everyone can provide their opinion, but if you ask someone, they will provide you their opinion. And in a newsroom, when I used to work in newsrooms, we would have information coming in only reflecting on one aspect of a situation, and then we would mark it as opinion, as editorial, because it's not neutral or it's not objective. So journalism needs to concentrate on the facts, and they need to hold the mic out to everyone. That's part of the journalist's role. Last week there was the FPGQ Congress, and there was a workshop that I found very interesting. It had to do with criminal proceedings against investigative journalists. So is this a new phenomenon? Do you see something concerning in that? No, I don't think it's something new. It's been a very long time that I've been working in this field. There we have always had proceedings, criminal proceedings or otherwise, against journalists when their work made people unhappy. Sometimes people try to find ways in which they try to muzzle us. So it's not new at all. But we have to do that investigative journalism work. The public broadcaster is very important in this sense, because it's expensive, it takes time, and it takes a lot of human resource. I have colleagues who spend months working on one file, for instance, so it takes a lot of depth.
We'll move to the New Democratic Party. Mr. Desjardins for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being present with us today on this important study. As you're aware, part of the importance of this discussion today related to the right to freedom of expression is largely related to the democratic project of Canada, trying to ensure that our democratic traditions, our democratic processes, and albeit the safeguarding of those for the next generation is I think, of paramount to many Canadians, and I think partly why I'm at this table. In my interest to discuss how we can ensure that there's a broad depth of democratic tradition. I'm concerned, particularly because I come from a younger generation, of this intersection between social media, our traditional media, and this idea that anyone and everywhere can have their own media source. If you don't like the media, you can invent your own media. You can create that media. You can have your own folks come to that media. And guess what? Maybe you can even get a billionaire to platform you in a way that you could have more voice. So in other words, some people have a larger ability to express themselves than others. In particular, I find the contrast between those who have money and those who do not have money. Those who have private interest are often using that private wealth to then manufacture a large perception and create a large level of influence on Canadians, even if those facts aren't true. This is particularly challenging for our courts, as we have lawyers who are present in this committee today. You're going to be seeing the advent of that in the courts and the challenges that are already present there. You're seeing that in our media space. It's having a real effect on our young people. It's having an effect on our seniors. It's having an effect on all Canadians. A senior came to me yesterday when I was back home and said, I'm scared. Every time I turn on Facebook, I see these wild, very far right-wing ads targeting her. She's never been someone to speak about violence or someone that is very polarizing. As a matter of fact, she's quite a good person. How is it that someone like her could be targeted by something so malicious like this that's telling her fellow Canadians are out to get her? This kind of division, often brought on by, I think, corporate interests, are finding a home and finding ways to delegitimize or attack traditional media. And so, Madam Foray, my questions will be focused on you. This is a rising concern for journalists and a rising concern right now in particular when it comes to our democratic tradition. Are you at all worried or concerned that the democratic principles of of Western countries is at stake when we so easily create a political environment where media and its truths are not held to a higher standard.
This goes back to the idea of what is journalism and where's your information coming from. So I think media literacy is something that the government needs to start focusing on. Young people in schools need to learn where to find their information sources and how to check them to make sure that these information sources are correct. When I hear that a teacher has told my son that he should go get his facts on Wikipedia, I have a problem because Wikipedia can be changed on a daily basis by whomever goes in there and puts information. It will be corrected in due time, but not necessarily when my kid goes in there. The damage is done. The damage is done. So knowing what are the sources of information and what makes a good source of information. Fact-checking, knowing. Traditional media was known for giving you the facts.
Yes. Yes, traditional media is known for giving the fact, and you just mentioned something that's of critical importance to me, which is this idea of where this information is coming from, the source. There's one company in Canada in particular that owns 80% of newspapers in our country. 80%. Can you name them just by that fact?
It's probably something to do with Postmedia.
It's Postmedia. Congratulations. Exactly. I'd hope that my colleagues could also confirm this fact without the wonderful
Do I get a
advice.
free coffee?
You get an award for sure for giving us a fact today that we can use. Facts and places of that source of fact are critical to this. 80% of our newspapers in Canada are owned by Postmedia. That's an extreme level of ownership. Where is Postmedia headquartered?
C'est aux États-Unis.
Sorry, can you say that one more time? Sorry, just for my
in the
purpose.
United States of America.
Thank you very much. It's in the United States of America. And why is it then, why could a company have so much interest in a country like Canada, so much so that they would invest to a point where they can nearly monopolize the entire newspaper industry at a level of 80%? What kind of interests would those companies have in Canada?
That you would have to ask those particular
Would profit
companies.
maybe be one of them? Probably. I'd imagine profit's likely one of those things. Truth? Perhaps, maybe not. Truth isn't necessarily profitable. That's the difficulty with this. Why is it so important to have public broadcasting? Why does Canada have a tradition of public broadcasting? I'm from the prairies. We're home to something fantastic like Access Television, where you can watch polka without any ads, and your grandparents get to watch it all day long, and they love it. I love it. Why is it that public broadcasting is so important, not just for polka, not just for watching polka around small communities, but for truth-telling?
For truth-telling and for bringing the microphone to everyone in Canada. So here's the point. So private broadcasters can't make money in the small communities. They can't go all over Canada. They open something in Nunavut or in Yellowknife. They're not going to make any money. The public broadcaster can bring the microphone to those small communities. I come from New Brunswick. And I've been all over Canada in different small communities. And in order for all those small communities to have access to those microphones, and another witness spoke to this, we need to make sure that everybody has a voice, an equal present. And that means feet on the ground by the public broadcaster, diffuseur public, all over the country in as many communities as possible.
Thank you. We'll move on to the 5-minute round. Mr. Couric for the Conservative Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. We heard earlier that one of the witnesses suggested that if Canadians couldn't view their news online, they should simply go to the library. And it certainly sounded a little bit like a let-them-eat-cake moment when it comes to the ability for Canadians to access content. And in a world in which, whether it's the devices we carry or the computers that we use, there's been a democratization of information that I think has been quite extraordinary, probably in the history of the world, although I think you can look back at different points in time and see other innovations. But certainly I hear from constituents all the time that are incredibly concerned about government overreach and wanting to control certain aspects of what that looks like, whether it's direct or whether it's indirect. Mr. Geist, in terms of Bill C-11 and C-18, you have one that has had a massive impact on Canadians' ability to see news content. And I've heard from many companies that would suggest that they just want to be able to share their content on those platforms and able to continue to get their content in front of the eyes of Canadians. And then you have C-11 that is kind of like this backdoor censorship idea that there's a mechanism for control within the bureaucracy. I'm wondering if you could comment specifically on those two pieces of legislation and the chilling effect that that has on freedom of speech and freedom of expression across this country.
We talked a little bit earlier about C-11, so let me focus for a moment on C-18. C-18 was predicted, and it was predictable, quite frankly, that if the legislation was introduced as is, it would cause a number of potential concerns. There was a likelihood that we would see blocking of news links, which is what's happened. It was likely that it would undermine trust, because if you find that there is more and more government regulation and government funding, I think it does run the risk of funding. Now, of diminishing trust. Now, with all due respect to my co-panelists here, the notion that we can solve all of this simply by more money to the CBC, or suggesting, with all due respect, that somehow Post Media owns 80% of newspapers and that's the problem, and at the same time note that now everybody has the ability to speak out. There are a lot of different sources, and if we only think about individual media properties as somehow having a monopoly on the news, then we're missing what is actually taking place right now, which is that there is a wide range of different sources. And one of the real harms that occurred with respect to C-18 was that it oftentimes excluded some of the more innovative players in the marketplace, and with a broad brush had the effect of excluding all of those players from major platforms like Instagram and Facebook.
So going to the library certainly isn't a solution. When it comes to C-11, the added bureaucracy and the CRTC, and I know you've written quite extensively about that, and how that level of control certainly is problematic in terms of Canadians being able to see that content, which there's this close connection between C-11 and C-18, which I know quite often the government doesn't like to see that connection made, but I'm wondering if you could comment on the C-11 side and simply Canadians being able to, while not be able to post content, the ability that it's limited in terms of what they can see.
11 hasn't stopped anybody from seeing anything online. The concern was on the algorithmic side as to whether or not, on the from a user content perspective, some content would be prioritized or deprioritized. Now, the CRTC just last week has launched new consultation that will focus on the meaning of Canadian content. We will see what it does with respect to discoverability, so it may prioritize some content over other content, and we may see that play out on some of these larger services. It isn't in the game of blocking particular content, though. There's nothing in C-11 that would move towards blocking of particular content.
Just in conclusion, has C-11 and C-18 had a chilling effect on innovation in Canada's mediascape?
Well, I think certainly, I think the answer to that would be yes, or at least from an investment perspective. When we look at C-11, the way the CRTC has begun to implement that law with basic mandated contributions, we've already seen increased prices for consumers. And we've seen some players that may look at the Canadian market and feel that the regulatory costs are too high. On C-18, I think it's even more significant, though, because if you lose one of your major distributors of your content, if there are no more links to your content through some of these larger platforms, this sends a signal that this is not a marketplace to invest in. And we've seen some of the larger independent players, Village Media, for example, stopped entering into new Canadian markets for a period of time out of concern. And the message that it sends to others who might want to enter into the marketplace by providing new innovative news services is that this is a market where there are some of the regulations may inhibit the ability to have success in the marketplace.
Thank you. We move to Ms. Gainey, the Liberal Party, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Geist, I'm kind of curious if we could for a second go back to some of your opening remarks regarding I guess, hate speech and by extension, the conversation around bubble legislation. This is something that I'm hearing quite a lot about in my community. Touching on some of the things you spoke about. There's obviously some tension there again with civil liberties that are a part of that discussion. And I think my colleague and maybe one of the witnesses also discussed, the balance of expression with equality and safety. So I'm wondering if you could maybe expand a little bit on that piece of your opening remarks in terms of this discussion and the role of the federal government specifically in protecting freedom of expression and freedom of protest with the balance of safety and I guess equality as well.
Raising that. At the end of this, we're scheduled to end around 2 o'clock, and over the course of the weekend, there were plans to launch a protest at what for a long time was my kid's school, Sir Robert Borden, here in Ottawa, and that was called off. They're instead going to apparently protest an MPP. But the notion of potentially protesting while kids are in school as young as 12 years old raises, I think, significant concerns. We've seen it at community centers. And so we have seen cities on a number of issues, not just with respect to anti-Semitism, which, as I note, has been by far the largest target in terms of hate crime in Canada over the last couple of years, and especially since October 7th. But I know Mississauga is also considering this, and they're considering not out of that issue, but out of other community members where we've seen tensions and some of this protest. I think that alongside similarly the decision that we saw coming out of the encampments at the University of Toronto seeks to have the balance, the same way Professor earlier mentioned, that we've got to find a way to allow people to protest, but where that endangers others, where that creates genuine fear that limits their own expression rights and even limits their own safety, that it is, I think, inappropriate, whereas we heard earlier that there is often a need to strike a balance. How do we ensure that people enjoy those protest rights, but at the same time others feel safe in their communities, in their places of worship, and in their schools? And bubble zone legislation allows for those protests to continue, but ensures the safety of many others. And I think that's been sorely lacking in many communities for the last number of months across the country.
There's certainly a sentiment of that feeling of insecurity and a lack of safety in particular around those places of worship and schools, as you mentioned, which has been very, very troubling to see over the last year. I guess if we could go back a second to the conversation around censorship as well, which has come up a few times here. I'm wondering if you could perhaps clarify in the spirit of the freedom of expression, part of how we get to these tense situations, I think, is a misunderstanding or a misalignment or a lack of truth or common understanding of what things mean and what is true. And we have that, I think, behind some of the misunderstandings around some of the protests and the content and the hate speech or the language that's being used there. So if we're free to say what we want and to create these environments where people just don't understand each other and don't have the same starting point, how do we clarify that, in my view, there is not censorship through the Online News Act, and that we shouldn't be fueling that notion that that's what that is, and that maybe that doesn't contribute to the real conversations that we should be having about how to legislate and how to improve people's safety and how to protect kids online and how to keep people safe. How do we find common ground to have these conversations if we can't agree on what things like censorship are?
Yeah, well, listen, it's been a significant challenge. It's a significant challenge, quite clearly. I think in some ways, I've tended not to use the word censorship when it comes to this legislation, even though I do think some of the bills that we've been talking about do raise real concerns. I think in terms of the kind of common understanding, and I think you heard it earlier, there is a difference between misinformation and disinformation. And on the misinformation side, I think there is a lot of misinformation, but I think a lot of that does go part and parcel with freedom of expression, and it isn't an intent to deceive. It merely some people aren't accurate or they're misinformed. That is distinct from disinformation, where someone, I think, has the, at times, intent to misinform and create potential some real harm through that disinformation. And on that front, whether or not we need the government to step in, or more likely, I think in some instances, because I think there are risks and there are charter limitations on what government can do. but more likely there is a role to play for, I think, some of the large platforms. We've seen over the last week or two this mass move towards blue sky for a lot of former Twitter users or X users. And I think part of that reflects the fact there are a lot of people who are frustrated with an environment where anything goes, there is this misinformation and disinformation, and they're looking for a place that they feel is a bit more trustworthy. So in some ways, the market actually addresses at least some of those issues, so long as there are some of those alternatives available.
Thank you. We'll move to Mr. Shampoo for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Professor Geist, I have another question for you. My party, the Bloc Québécois, tabled a bill that suggests, well, it came after a protest where Adil Sharkawi had very violent remarks inciting people to violence, calling for the elimination of Canada and the United States, but also Israel. So in the aftermath of all this, we proposed a modification to the criminal code to remove the the religious exception from the criminal code, because this religious exception allows an individual who is uttering remarks under the guise of their religious beliefs to say things that would go beyond what's reasonable. So this bill, would it encroach upon the freedom of expression or the freedom of religion according to the reading of things that you have done, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Criminal Code?
Well, thanks for that. I think the answer is yes, it would, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a non-starter. And as we've heard, there is a balancing act to be had when it comes to all of the rights. And in a sense, that's built into our charter. I mean, we heard earlier that is a hallmark of the Canadian approach, that these rights aren't absolute, and there is a need to balance. And so balancing freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, some of the other, and association, some of those other rights are always going to be a challenge. And where there may be people who use some of these rights to engage in conduct that quite clearly is not just harmful in terms of what's being said, but has had real world impact in terms of the safety of kids going to school or people going to their synagogues. There is a need to act. We've seen some of that. We saw that, for example, with Samudan fairly recently, which was also some of their people involved in some of these kinds of protests. But after more than a year of these experiences and this massive increase in targeting communities, in my case, particularly the Jewish community, there is a need to act.
Est-ce que vous pensez que...
Do you think that this article of the criminal code, this exception, should it have even existed in the first place, or and people feel a bit more free to express these kinds of opinions? I mean, maybe this is what is leading us to make the changes we talked about.
Yeah, no, listen, I don't know the history of the inclusion of that particular provision, but I suspect it was based on a vision of a robust protection for freedom of religion and a recognition that there was potential risks of a chill in terms of that ability to practice if we were seen to criminalize certain kinds of speech. But at the same time, if that is used as a safeguard or as a mechanism to get to engage in hateful conduct, then surely we have to consider how to address that kind of conduct, that religion doesn't provide a sort of a blank to allow people to say anything, especially when it creates some of these kinds of harms.
Thank you, Mr. Desjardins, for 2.5.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'll now turn to Madam Mahoney, who's just joining us online. Thank you so much for all your work. I know that you've been familiar with a great deal and scope of work over your time. In particular, you were appointed as the chief negotiator for the Assembly of First Nations to negotiate the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. Is that correct?
That's correct.
However, there seems to be, at least in my short-lived experience, however, it's been one that's been witness to a very severe level of inaction by the federal government when related to Indigenous claims, particularly claims that are largely sought through the court. There's options that the government has, of course. They can negotiate these claims, these instances of great historic injustice and also contemporary injustice, as we're seeing in the case of the Child and Family Service litigation case. One may only look to this year's budget, which had the Liberals literally celebrating $58 billion that they were court-ordered to spend on First Nations because of settlements like the one you'd fought for. It created a situation where nations were forced to try their luck in the court because the federal government is so fundamentally committed to addressing these issues in the court. They don't have a perspective that involves Indigenous peoples having these claims heard in any other fashion other than a court, or by way of a court order, or by way of reducing liability. This is what's been clear to Indigenous people, particularly First Nations, as they pursue their rights in court. My question is, why do you think the government prefers forcing Indigenous people to the courts by way of litigation rather than just respecting their rights at the onset and create a framework that would allow for these very serious claims to be heard properly? What does your experience in the court tell you in relation to this very severe injustice?
Well, that's a very good question. It's very difficult to answer, but frankly, sometimes it seems that the government doesn't know what to do, so it would rather have the courts tell them what to do and then massage that decision into what it thinks it should do. So in some respects, I suppose that the government wants input from the judicial sector, but many, many times the court has said very clearly to Canada that negotiation is the best way to resolve land claims and other legitimate claims. And there's some resistance to that, or there's just an unwillingness to budge on important matters that need to be resolved, and they end up in the courts. And it's an unfortunate situation. You're absolutely correct. But it's often the bureaucracy that blocks progress, I must say. You can hear the politicians say one thing, and often the bureaucracy does another, which is a very, very frustrating situation.
Thank you. We're going to move on to the final round. The Conservatives and the Liberals for 5 minutes. We'll start with Mr. Gourd for 5.
Thank you, Chair. My question will be for Ms. Foray. You said you have 30 years of experience in the field of journalism. Have you witnessed an evolution in terms of the freedom of expression over those years? Because in the last 30 years, was there something that you were able to say 30 years ago or in those 30 years and now you wouldn't be able to? Have you felt or have you experienced a kind of an evolution in that sense? Well, I think what's being said on the media outlets, it simply follows what's being said by Canadians at large. Personally, I think we have more broader access to media, to different types of rhetoric, because there are more sources of information. When I started in this field when I was younger, while you had 2-3 channels on the TV, you had a couple newspapers, that was it. But we felt that these people and the information coming from them, we could rely on them, we could trust them. But now we have more resources, but we're not always sure that what we are reading is true. So we need to be able to help Canadians understand what a real information source is, what is reliable information, and what they can have trust in. So because it happens often that people start trusting a source only to realize later on that what they've been consuming as information has not really been the truth. So we have to be careful selecting our sources. While you refer to ecosystems, public and private, but there's also a digital ecosystem over which there is almost no control, because in public and private, while you have people in charge, editors, etc., so there is more attention being paid to what's being pushed out, but in digital that's less the case. But of course, we have a lot of confidence in the work of professional journalists doing a good job. But if there is instruction, for instance, given to them? Does it ever occur that they are not able to say what they think or what they feel like they should be publishing? Or maybe are they given direction? Or is it completely free? Well, I worked for a public broadcaster, but when you are working in the private sector, if you're not following, you're not doing what the boss is saying, well, your contract might not be renewed. That's the reality of working in the private sector. But when you work for the public broadcaster, that's not the case at all. You can say, you can reflect whatever the situation is, and you can do the work you want. So there is editorial independence in that sense. The last 10 years, I've had experience in the digital field. Well, it's the same thing, but in digital platforms, whatever is pushed out, it stays available. So if you want news to be reliable on TV and radio and digital, well, on the digital side, you need to be even more careful because it's always out there. It's always going to exist. So there's a certain level of responsibility to make sure that, well, if you have said some things and those turn out not to be not true, you need to go back and make corrections. So reliable media it's also one of the hallmarks of reliable media, and it happens to everyone everywhere. No one is perfect, but when mistakes are made, you go back and correct those mistakes, and that's also how you can have trust in a media outlet that they are reasonable and that they are reliable. So in the public sphere, a journalist that makes a mistake, well, they're told that they made an error because they said what they were thinking. Well, has there been no journalist at CBC Radio Canada who left to go to the private market and maybe they're happier on the other side? Well, I cannot really answer that question because I don't follow people. I would need to go out and ask the question specifically to everyone who has done the transition. But at work, of course, there are people who influence what we do. But when you have certain responsibilities in the public broadcasting side is to make sure that the facts are there and what is being said is true, that it's balanced. So you need to hear from all parties. You cannot just convey one single point of view, and the facts need to be included and the sources need to be checked.
Over 5 minutes. Thank you very much. So we have the final round. Just stick around. We have a budget item that we'll deal with after we release our guests. We sent it out last Friday to you. It will only take 10 seconds, but just to remind you, in fact, check your emails from last Friday. Yeah, you wouldn't have got that. Okay, Mr. Noor Mohammed, for the final 5 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. Professor Geist, let me start with you. You talked about Bill S-210 and the concerns around that. I share your concerns. I think it is a deeply flawed piece of legislation with some good intention. I think that is clear, but I think that the execution on this is, if rolled out the way the bill proposes, could actually be quite problematic. Very briefly, if you could summarize your concern around the enforcement of this, particularly as it relates to the private sector having to decide, being in a position to hold data and in particular to determine age verification. What are some of the concerns around that you would have?
Well, I'm glad you raised it. There are several major concerns with S-210. I mentioned some in the opening with respect to mandated blocking of content and getting internet providers to block that as well. I think that raises serious issues. The use of age verification technologies. We've seen privacy commissioners around the world raise real concerns about this issue. I must admit, I find it both problematic and deeply puzzling that we would rush ahead with a piece of legislation when our own privacy commissioner is still studying the implications of using age verification technologies. And what we know is that where the technology is at right now either requires the provision of highly sensitive personal information, uploading to services outside the country by and large, identification documents that are government issued, which raises issues around identity theft, or it's based on technology that tries to guesstimate your age, which simply doesn't work in legislation that is designed to distinguish between someone who is 17 and 18. just go into any high school or first-year university class and try to determine who's 17, who's 18, and who's 19. If we can't do it as individuals, are we really going to trust some sort of algorithm to make that determination?
So just on that point, just very quickly, because to speak to those that may support this bill, there are those who have supported this bill and think it's a very, very good piece of legislation. Many of our conservative colleagues have said they support this, but at the same time also decry the idea of digital ID. I mean, how do you reconcile those two thoughts? If you're against digital ID, but you support digital identification, verification, age verification held by the private sector, what would you say to them to kind of clear up that misunderstanding?
Well, I think it's line drawing between saying the government is going to issue an ID and I'm going to provide my actual ID to some third party that I may have even less trust in as part of this system. I think the risks from a security and privacy perspective are very real, but especially if we're having a discussion around freedom of expression, the site blocking, the overbroad use of this would apply not just to pornography sites. This would apply to search sites, would apply to streaming sites. It's hard to reconcile saying there's deep concern about stopping acts about censorship and freedom of expression when we're considering legislation that would actually, in an overbroad way, require some sort of pre-approval to be able to conduct a Google search or watch some streaming services on something like Crave or Netflix.
So your advice to members of the Conservative Party and others who support this legislation would be that they should not?
My understanding is it's been all the opposition parties that at least previously voted for it, and I think it's a mistake, and it needs to go back to the drawing board.
Thank you. I want to take a bit of a different line of questioning now with the 2 minutes I think that I have left. My colleague, Mr. Desjardins, started asking questions about foreign ownership of the media and some of the challenges and concerns there. When Post Media was taken over by a U.S. hedge fund, they were told to be, quote unquote, more reliably conservative. Madame Forêt, to you, what do you think the concerns are in terms of freedom of expression of journalists when they are told that the editorial direction of a publication has to be a certain way?
If they're told that the direction has to be a certain way, ils ne peuvent vraiment pas faire leur travail.
They can't really do their work. But with a certain level of transparency, if you know that a daily is of a certain leaning, then you have a certain perception as to the kind of information you will find on these outlets. But it's important for us as media workers that there be a multiplication of sources. So media cannot really be concentrated in the hands of just one group. That is a problem. So if you make sure that there is no concentration in the hands of a few, then there will be information coming from multiple sources, and Canadians will have a higher chance of having a balanced vision.
Very quickly.
On what Madame Forêt just said. Do you see, you talked about earlier, if there are other voices that need to be amplified, you need to be heard. Are you concerned at all that foreign ownership and foreign direction of where Canadian journalism or media should go has the same chilling impact when there is not the ability for a counterbalance or for other voices to emerge within the ecosystem?
Very cool. I think there's reason for concern with foreign interference. I must admit, especially in some of the regulated sectors, I've never totally understood some of the objections to foreign ownership. You know, broadcasters, for example. Doesn't really matter who owns it. What matters is what rules are associated with it. In an internet environment, I recognize clearly when you've got large foreign players, there's more risk. Candidly, that fact means we'd want to bring some of those players in, which makes the recent TikTok decision a bit puzzling, because I don't understand why we'd kick out a company that makes it more difficult to enforce against it, where we've got some of those kinds of issues. So I think we need to seek to ensure there is a role for regulation of these large players. Part of it is ensuring that they do operate here and we've got appropriate rules in place.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Geis. Thank you, Ms. Forêt, and thank you, Ms. Mahoney, for the last hour. For committee business, a budget for the study of the protection of freedom of expression. The amount was $36,700. It was circulated to all committee members last Friday. Is it the pleasure of the committee to adopt this budget?
This is just to clarify, Chair, this is just on this exact study.
That's right.
Oh, I understand.
That's right. Okay,
Yeah.
well, it's,
Well, we're in it, so so we might as well.
yeah, it's 4 meetings. Well, there's
for flights, right? They get
6 meetings, actually. Okay, so we're going to go with that. Is it the committee in agreement today to adjourn this meeting? Is it? Good, thanks. Done.
Thank you very much.
You're pretty good.
Here.